Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm Tami Stacklehouse, fibromyalgia coach, author, and founder of the International Fibromyalgia Coaching Institute. The goal of this podcast is to empower you with access to the dream team of experts and coaches I've discovered are key to living the fibro life you love. From the comfort of your own home, and maybe even your pajamas, I'll help you take back control of your life and health. To help out with fibro fog, I always include full show notes and additional resources at fibromyalgiapodcast.com. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stacklehouse, and this is episode 84. As I mentioned in our last episode, I have asked my friend Ramses Rodriguez to come back to talk about panic attacks and anxiety. If you haven't heard it, in our last episode, we flipped the tables and Ramses interviewed me about the expanded edition of my book, Take Back Your Life. In today's episode, we're going to flip things back around the way they usually are, and I am interviewing him. So Ramses comes to this work, like most of us do, with his own story. He was once plagued by panic attacks himself. In fact, he talks about that in today's interview. Now he is able to help people who are suffering from panic and anxiety with science-based and holistic modalities. He's done a lot of research and has combined a lot of that information together for people. Ramses holds a Master of Science degree in developmental genetics and combines science theory and alternative therapies to help people remain panic-free while keeping the career of their dreams. Ramses has written 2 books in the genre of anxiety relief. In his first book, Stop Pressing Your Own Panic Button, Ramses details the process he leads professionals through to achieve lasting relief from panic attacks. In his second book, The End of Writer's Block, Ramses addresses the most effective tools for overcoming performance anxiety. Ramses lives in Northern Virginia and has started the Panic Freedom Academy, which is where he teaches professionals how to overcome panic attacks. Now, as always, I do want to remind you that the information shared in this podcast is not to be considered medical advice, and it definitely does not replace consulting with your own doctor or healthcare providers. As Ramses talks about in the interview today, there are some overlaps with other more serious conditions, and so you really want to make sure that you really are dealing with panic attacks and anxiety and that it isn't something more serious. So with the information you hear in today's episode, please take that to your providers. And if this truly is what you're dealing with, Ramses is a great resource. Stay tuned after the interview. We will have today's listener shout out, and I also will have a couple additional episodes that touch on some of the topics we talked about today. And if you're interested in exploring those more, I'll have those at the end as well. Enjoy. Hey, welcome. I'm so glad I get to turn the tables and interview you this time.
I know. I feel like I'm in the hot seat now.
Ooh, you just wait. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, your area of expertise is really panic attacks and anxiety. Of course, you interviewed me last time, kind of related to the work you've done with writer's block and working with authors. But this time, I really want to dig into the panic attacks and anxiety piece of things, because anxiety in particular comes a lot with fibromyalgia. I think there's probably some biological things that are happening the same in both of us, but some people really struggle with. So you come into this not just as an expert who knows a little something. You have your own story. Would you share some of that?
Oh, absolutely. I love how you said that, by the way. You have your own little something. So I got into this whole world of panic attacks and anxiety because, quite frankly, I had a lot of panic attacks. And I think it's very easy to say something like, oh, I've had 1 or 2. No, these were the ones that were happening a lot, multiple times a week. I couldn't really predict where they were happening, when they were going to happen, and how severe. I came from the world of science. I was a geneticist. I went into designing cancer tests of all things.
Oh, gosh.
I know it was a whole
No
world, right?
stress.
No stress at all, right? And being so tied into that whole, we call it publish or perish mentality. So it's kind of an ongoing hustle as a scientist, and all the labs are just cranking it out. And I'd worked really hard. I was being groomed to either go to Ivy League or go to med school. It was just really intense. And I loved it, to be honest. None of that bothered me, except panic attacks got in the way.
So maybe underneath it was bothering you?
So maybe underneath it was bothering me, right? Ooh, we're getting to the good stuff quick, aren't we?
Can't help it.
Right. No, so exactly that. I was having panic attacks, I would say around 3 to 4 times a week. And funny enough, recently I'd done this survey of about 48 people so far. From the time you're hearing this, about 48 individuals. And I interviewed them and asked them what symptoms they had when they had panic attacks. And I ended up with over 50, and I had over 55% of those symptoms during my time of having panics at once. So it was like 50% of all the symptoms people say they have, I ended up with in a single episode multiple times a week. And they could start to, I always call it ruining your life because you work so hard, you have a career. I mean, I did, and it was my dream to either be a scientist or a doctor. And here they are creeping up. Simple things like driving to work were hard. And I remember my worst panic attack landed me in the hospital in the ER with an Ativan drip in my left arm. They said, we don't know what to do with him. We're just going to knock him out. Because it can get kind of scary. By that point, I knew that's what they were. And I think that's super important for anyone listening. It's one of those things that I don't like anyone to self-diagnose. Like, actually talk to someone, make sure what you're having are panic attacks. Because I think in a moment we will talk a little bit about symptoms, but the symptoms do share with a lot of very serious other episodes for other comorbidities or other diagnoses in general. And so I always like to say, hey, if you feel like you are having panic attacks, definitely go talk to someone about that specifically, because they are very serious symptoms. But once you know you have them, you kind of know what to expect, unfortunately. And once they start, like in my case, I had to let them go through, and I didn't know the timing. And so things like all of my schooling, all of my work as a geneticist, it was being affected. And I didn't take on a promotion because of that. I ended up losing a gig because of that. I lost a partner because of that. I was in my 20s during the bulk of that, and my libido was shot. I know it's like a thing, but when you're either on medications or having that much anxiety, you're just not in the mood. So that affected my relationships as well. And as you can see, it kind of spirals. And eventually I said, well, the one thing I'm good at is research. So when my doctor said, hey, I don't know what to tell you, you have anxiety, take these Xanax and cope with it the rest of your life. I was like, no, I don't really like these side effects, and I won't take no for an answer. That's part of me being a little bit hard-headed.
Right.
Right. And I was just like, I can't take no for an answer. And I feel like there has to be another way. So when I took the medication, I employed my skill, which is research. I was really good at that. And I researched high and low. I always joke and I say, I left no stone unturned. I looked at Eastern and Western modalities, things that were holistic versus medication. Like, I really said, I'm going to be an expert at this because at the very least, I can find out something that could work for me. Because I wasn't able to function. Going on a plane and traveling was hard. Going to see my father, who I was living in New York. He lived in Florida. Obviously, traveling to go see him was hard. So I decided to do all this research. And that's where I started to realize that, it's not that there's this whole secret around it, is that everyone had a piece of the puzzle. And if we have the right puzzle pieces, string them together just right, you can come up with a repeatable way of addressing anxiety and panic attacks and minimizing it to the point where those panics are in remission. And that's where my book came out of.
Right. You had already done all the research. You just had to share it with people.
Exactly. And I wrote the book. I may have told you, I don't know if everyone's heard, but it led to a book. It was called Stop Pressing Your Own Panic Button. And basically, I repeat that. I started working with people and saw that they were getting similar results. Their anxiety had decreased so much that the panics were just not happening. And that was nice because not only did it help me, it started to help others. And that's how this whole thing started, me coaching panic attacks.
Right, right. So I think this would be a good time to start talking about like, what is a panic attack? What were some of those symptoms? I know so many people with fibromyalgia deal with anxiety. And I also just have to say right here, y'all, if you are having a symptom, don't just blame it all on fibromyalgia. Panic attacks and anxiety, these are things that are treatable in and of themselves, right? And so we don't want to just say, oh, that's my fibromyalgia, and just address the fibromyalgia because we can't address these other things. And by addressing these other things, you're actually going to help your fibro. So we want to look at all of that. So having said that, share with us a little bit, like, what was your experience? What do other people experience? How does somebody know that that is what they're having, that it's a panic attack?
Great question. The reason I love this question so much is because we get to talk about the symptoms. Oftentimes, it is confusing because panic attacks is what people call it, but sometimes they call it anxiety attacks. I had someone said they just called it panics or freakouts, and another term I heard was meltdowns. So because there's so many terms around, it can get a little confusing about what's going on. And technically, if you're listening, you may or may not know this, but the DSM-5, which is the manual therapists use to diagnose, right, only really has panic disorder on there. There's no diagnosable thing called anxiety attacks or freakouts or meltdowns. So it's almost more important that you know based on symptoms if we're talking about the same thing, as opposed to the label, because most people don't even go around saying they have panic disorder. They'll just say, I had a panic attack or an anxiety attack. And so not to say that either of those are wrong or right or whatever. It's just that it's more important to know the symptoms. The symptoms are very, very long. The most common symptom for anxiety is increased heart rate. Most people will realize I have anxiety, my heart rate goes up a little bit. And the next frequent one is shaking or tremors. Other frequent ones are like lightheadedness or dizziness. Shortness of breath is another one. But then you get into less typical ones that can get a little scary, like tight chest, rapid breathing, feeling faint or disoriented. Some people experience a sense of derealization, which is things kind of feel not real and real at the same time. It's like this odd phase you're in. And others are arrhythmias, or people perceive them as like heart palpitations. And then there's psychological symptoms that people often say they feel like they're going to die, or overwhelming fear comes on, or they feel like they have to hide. An increased sense of crying might happen, or people might cry during it because it's just so scary. So as I said, those symptoms are pretty scary to listen to, but the reason it's important to go talk to someone, like I said, is to rule out all the scary stuff. Because usually, and this is to get to your question at the core, is what is a panic attack? A panic attack is anxiety inducing very severe physiological symptoms, right? So anxiety has increased so much that now you're having a physical reaction to it. Because anxiety really is a lot of molecules in your body being released, triggering all sorts of things, and your nervous system is one of the main ones reacting. So you're going to have a lot of things having to do with heart or regulation of temperature, like sweating, shakiness. All those, it's because anxiety has now taxed the physical system of the nervous system. And it could be a little scary, but like I said, rule all the scary stuff out. Then you'll know exactly when it's happening. Even though it is scary, you'll know, hey, nothing worse is happening.
Right, right. I've had several clients who have dealt with panic attacks, and almost every single one of them on their first one thought they were having a heart attack.
Yes, very common. Unfortunately, the second that people think they're having is a stroke. It's because the tingling or numbness can happen on one side of the body as opposed to both at the same time. And then they think, hey, this is one-sided, which is indicative usually of stroke. But the professionals do these things called neurocheck, and they could rule that out easily with that test in a clinic or hospital situation.
Right, right. That's so fascinating. With fibromyalgia, our nervous system is kind of stuck in fight or flight. Like it's one of the hallmarks with fibro. And what you're talking about is sort of more the physiological aspects of fight or flight, which to me is like bells are ringing in my head of no wonder people with fibro deal with a lot of anxiety and panic attacks. It sounds like there's a lot of the underlying things that are the same.
Yeah, because the key about anxiety, really any big emotion you're having, but anxiety is the main driver for panic and anxiety attacks. So I like to just talk about that one. But you're going to perceive something, and that could be generated inside of your mind, or you watch something, you witness an event. And wherever that first thing that triggers your thoughts, that's going to cause you then to have an emotional response. And so whenever you have some kind of circumstance triggering a thought, that's going to trigger the emotional response. And if your baseline for that emotion, say anxiety in this case, is really elevated above normal, I'll say, then your chances of hitting a panic threshold are just high because you're so close to that. My nervous system is going to give me the shoot the bird at me.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
We're already so close. We have less grace period or something, like less space to accommodate. So
I love how you said that. Yes, the grace. Because here's the thing. Everyone experiences anxiety. Like that's a part of the lexicon of emotions anyone has. And so for someone who's a non-panicker, their anxiety is just going to blip. It's just going to go up a little bit per situation. Like if you get cut off on the road, you'll get a little anxiety, but it'll return back to normal, like zero or a very neutral emotional state. And it'll just blip every time there's an anxious moment. You get cut off on the road, someone yells and you get startled, or your dog chases a raccoon. I don't know. You'll get little moments of anxiety. But for someone who is a panicker, what happens is they're anxious all the time. So their baseline is already elevated above neutral. So any new inciting incident is going to get you super close to what I call the panic threshold. Because once it starts, for anyone who has panic attacks, you just basically have to let it ride out because it's started. It's now a cascade of symptoms. And the key then to getting that panic in remission is reducing your level of anxiety altogether. I call that reducing your anxiety baseline. Just bring it back down to neutral. And like that, you're out of the red zone, I call it. You're out of the hot zone of getting that panic attack.
Right, exactly. It's so interesting talking about this because when I think of anxiety, I think of a mental/emotional, not dismissive in any way, but just like I think similar to depression, right? Like it's something that's happening in your neurochemistry or whatever. But hearing you talk, there's so much more physicality to this than just emotions.
There is. Oh, wow. And that's the scary part about panic attacks, I think. And that's why people will often say, like, I feel like I'm dying. It's in my experience, and I'm not going to say this is true for everyone, but in my experience, it's an emotion like no other because of how physical it is. In fact, when people have that much anxiety or after a panic attack, it's so much physical exertion that you kind of crash. We talked a little bit about fibro fog, but there's like an anxiety fog related to this where it's hard to focus when you're really anxious all the time. Simple tasks are difficult. Like you sit at your computer, you're going to check email and you're like, what was I doing? Like you can't get there. And then you do, and the task feels laborious and all you're doing is checking your email, right? And then after a panic attack, you expend so much energy that you could almost become catatonic. It's like the state of like you could almost hear people, but you can't respond. Your body just shuts you down for a little moment. That could get scary. That was happened to me I mentioned earlier that I'd ended up in the ER. I'd become catatonic, and I remember that they thought I was having a seizure because it was happening so fast, to be honest. I was like, what order of events happened even? But you could become catatonic because you get so fatigued afterward. And it becomes, again, difficult to bounce back. A lot of people who have panic attacks experience a lot of shame because of this, because you temporarily lose control of your body, it feels. I remember after my panics, I would apologize. I was overly apologetic. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And they're like, don't apologize. And my friends and roommates at the time were trying to be super supportive. It's very difficult for people around panickers to be able to help because they don't know what to do. But yeah, it is a very surprisingly very physical emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. I can totally see that. And then just like crashing afterwards, right? Like naps, things like that. I mean, that's how some people actually respond to stress. My husband, if he gets too stressed out, like he has to take a nap. He couldn't keep his eyes open if he wanted to, you know?
Oh, it's so true. Oh my. I remember having to plan a lot of bathroom breaks at work just to like kind of remove myself from a situation and just around people. And believe it or not, it was when I was doing that, I started to realize that part of the reason the anxiety level is so high is because I did respond to my surroundings a lot more than most people. And just to get a little into the metaphysical side of panics now is that's when I came across the work of like HSPs, highly sensitive people. And similarly in the spiritual world or other communities, you might hear the term empath. Now, at the time, I never knew they were the same thing. I just did not, because I was in the science realm. I was like, where's the primary literature on this? And then I started realizing that the HSP literature really gave a name and a mechanism to what empaths were experiencing. And then the empaths had a lot of the words or anecdotal evidence of what HSP literature was describing. So I started to put it together. I was like, oh, they're talking about the same person. And what I found was people who are having panic attacks, not just what I call situational panics. Like if you're in a car accident and you have a panic attack, it's very obvious. We could attribute that episode to that incident. But if you're having panic attacks where it's almost irregular and you can't track what's causing them or when you're going to have them or how intense they are, you may be reacting to your environment differently. And the HSP literature talks about mechanism, about the way we interact with our environment, say different people, different moods. There's a term called emotional contagion. That means like, you know, when you walk into a room and everyone's kind of moody and you're like, whoa, what happened in here? HSPs or empath could really pick up on that, but it'll affect them because they think something's wrong with them. And they're like, oh, I don't know if it's me. Is it on my head? They always say I'm overthinking things. So maybe I'm overthinking the situation.
You're just too sensitive.
So too sensitive. And really starting to give those things a label and a name started to organize it in my brain. Because our minds like to be super optimized. They don't like to be caught off guard. They want buckets. Your brain wants buckets. Those buckets in psychology are called schema. And it wants to have a bucket for things to place it, you know? I imagine a bunch of cubbies for little kids, and these toys go in this bucket, and these puzzles go in this bucket. Well, if you're experiencing things and you don't have a place for them, that causes anxiety because your brain is now just overworking, trying to sort and make sense of those events. So if you're around people and they're overly emotional and you start to have a physiological response, then your brain is like, I don't know what's going on. And I've had a lot of people say, what's wrong with me? Why am I panicking? Or what's wrong with me? Am I going crazy? In fact, I went to my doctor and I said, hey, I just had this panic attack, was in the ER. They gave me Xanax. Now, I'm here to talk to you because I want you to tell me what flavor of crazy I am. I really said that to her.
That's awesome.
She said, okay, sit down. And I said, no, really, I'm super anxious. And I was like in tears, you know, and I was like, I don't know what to do. I feel like off. And so she proceeded to ask me a bunch of questions, and I answered as honestly as I could. And by the end of it, I said, hey, listen, so what's the diagnosis? Like, I was worried it was all sorts. My brain had Googled all the wrong things.
Oh, yes. Dr. Google, and you'll be dead in 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Google made anxiety worse, I promise. So she said, listen, first of all, no one comes into my office asking to be diagnosed crazy. So you already don't sound crazy, just FYI. But second, I've checked, the questions I just asked you were to rule out borderline personality, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, nothing. Really, you're anxious. Here are some Xanax. And if you have other ways to look into this, you mentioned some spiritual things or holistic things, look into that, talk to professionals in that space. Because with what I can do, this is where I draw the line. Like, I don't have anything else for you. And I remember leaving kind of upset. I was like, oh, she doesn't have anything for me.
Especially, I imagine, as a scientist.
Yes.
Right? Like,
I was like,
science can surely fix this.
yes. Like, science always bails you out. But then I took a step back and I realized what she hadn't done was say I was crazy, and that she had not said there wasn't a solution. She said, I just don't have it. And I was like, interesting. She's the first person who said, you might be onto something. There might be another way. And I was like, oh, okay, this is what she's saying. So I sought out maybe more spiritual, holistic therapists. I, chatted with a few, had a couple sessions. I started diving into any kind of literature related to anxiety and remedies for it. Listen, I even tried it. I started taking Reiki classes and trying to figure out what is this whole energy mechanism people say they experience. And when I took a step back, I was realizing there is something to it, because you can have very physiological responses from managing your mind. And when I started to have that firsthand experience, I was like, oh my God, my anxiety is going down. And I stopped panicking. I get chills. Oh my God. I don't want to cry, but I'm like, oh my God. I remember those moments. I was like, I haven't had a panic attack in months now. And it was multiple weeks, remember? And I really got excited and jazzed up. I mean, so much so that I ended up leaving genetics. I worked in private sector for a while, working with a publishing company, but still doing anxiety and performance coaching. And then finally started my academy, the Panic Freedom Academy, just to help people exclusively with panics and anxiety.
That's so exciting. I mean, I think the thing that is so challenging about things like anxiety or fibromyalgia is that, like, everything feels so out of our control, right? Like, I can't control when I'm going to have a fibro flare. I can't control when I'm going to have a panic attack, right? But the deeper you dig into these kinds of things, especially when you get that mind-body connection, just to be clear, we're not saying it's all in your mind or that you're imagining.
Exactly. Right,
but our brains are powerful things, and really your brain is controlling everything. Your brain is controlling your heart rate all the time. So that means it's also controlling it when it's going fast, when it's going slow, right? So I think the power of what you do, what I do, is giving people back some control.
Yes.
Right? Some insight, being able to make things a little bit more predictable. I know that's what's so hard with fibromyalgia. It's like, can't make plans for 2 weeks out because I don't know how I'm going to feel. Same thing, I imagine, with
Same thing. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's wild. I love that you put it that way, giving people power back. For me, and I would imagine for you in the fibro world, by the way, I've listened to everything that you've ever put out. So I know how much great value you're giving us. I'm part of your audience. And to be honest, giving people knowledge and giving the people the ability to organize the chaos really starts to take the edge off. For panickers, it really starts to decrease that anxiety. When you have a label, when you have a way of describing what's going on. And then, of course, the second tier is, now that you have some labels, what do you do with it? Like, what do you do with it? Because there are still practical things you could do in your day-to-day that actually work to bring that anxiety baseline down. It's not as elusive as we would feel or we think when we get a diagnosis of panic disorder and they say you have to be on Xanax the rest of your life. That is certainly part of the picture. And I always like to say this, Tami, sometimes I always put this out there because it might seem like I'm saying medications are bad or anything. And that's not at all what I'm saying. Is that there's more to the picture of anxiety than just medication. In fact, medications are what helped me develop this work because I only had lucid moments when I was on the Xanax. And so I used those periods to do the most of my research, try things out, write my book or drafts of it. I had already stopped panicking by the time I was doing all the writing, but it's not what I'm saying. It's just that there's more to it. And then being willing to say, I'm ready to look at other things, I think was the first breakthrough for me. I was still anxious. I still didn't know what those other things were, but I said, there's got to be another way, and stopped listening to just the one track, me being a scientist, that's the only way. Funny enough, what I found out was none of it really contradicted the science. Not all of it is explained thoroughly yet, but it's pretty impressive the kind of work that's out there on anxiety specifically, the type of people who get it, and the kinds of solutions there are. There's tons of research already out there.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So I have one more sort of sciencey question for you, and then I would love to talk about some of those more practical things. So one of the things that I have heard about when it comes to anxiety, in fact, I just heard this on the radio the other day, was exposure therapy.
Okay.
And so when I hear those words, exposure therapy, what pops into my mind is, I'm afraid of spiders. You're going to make me hold a tarantula.
That's exactly what I hear. In fact, I think I just saw a tarantula in my eye.
I know that there's a lot more to that. In fact, you and I talking privately, we had talked about like just getting used to those physiological responses, and that just because your heart is beating faster doesn't mean it's a panic attack kind of a thing. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because people have probably heard that term, exposure therapy, and what all that means.
Yeah. So exposure therapy, when I took psychology classes in college, I heard it in the same context. I heard it in the context of phobias is where I first learned it. And the idea being, yes, we slowly expose you to the thing you're afraid of so that you could manage this irrational fear, which is the definition of a phobia. So if you're afraid of spiders, we would first show you a picture of a spider on a wall away from you. Then you would walk closer to it. Then you would probably go into a room and we would say, there's a spider right over there. We put it in a circle, look at it, and then walk out. So just slowly, incrementally getting you to that. Maybe they'll teach you about spiders, maybe. And so you start to put this whole thing together so that the whole entire fear, the irrational fear is not irrational anymore. I suppose that's the thing. When it comes to anxiety, though, the tricky part is we might not know exactly what triggers it. So with anxiety, it's our thoughts sometimes. But then, like I said, if you're actually reacting to your environment differently and you don't know to what capacity, it's kind of tough to do exposure therapy because you don't know what for. Also, with anxiety and emotional triggers, it's more important to find out the root cause. Now, I will say this, that to me did not make sense at all. And when people say, like, find the root cause of the thing, it didn't make sense to me at all. But really what it's saying is, what specifically event, fact, thought, circumstance is prompting you to have that physiological response? So it's going to be a concrete thing, and it could be a memory. It could be a thought you're having currently. It could be replaying like a scene in your head. Whatever that might be, we don't know what the actual root cause is, but there are tools to find them. And the moment I realized, okay, there are ways to diffuse these triggers, then I was like, okay, that's the route we need to go with panic attacks, because panic attacks driven by anxiety is triggered. And so all these triggers incrementally or sustained cause the anxiety baseline to be really, really elevated, and it causes people to be more susceptible to a panic attack. So exposure therapy, I guess, is effective for phobias. It's almost not a way my brain thinks about handling anxiety because of the nature of the source of it. We know we experience it on a mental and physiological level, but I didn't think when I started this that it was limited to those points of origin, because there's so many other ways we can interact with our surrounding.
Right. And, if you don't know what that cause is, what that trigger is, like there's a lot of work you have to do before you can even get to that. Right. There's a lot of knowing yourself and
So
exploring
much
and
of that.
thinking about what you're thinking. Right.
It's so meta. And that was so hard for me, Tammy, because as a scientist, when someone says, have mind-body connection, or be aware of your body, or your body's telling you this or that, it was like a foreign language. I didn't know what do you mean my body's communicating to? No, it's not. It's pretty quiet. I'm pretty sure my brain's the one doing the talking right now, or my mouth.
Right.
So starting out with the very simple exercises that teach you super fundamental things, like specifically, what is the definition of an emotion? Specifically, what is the definition of a thought? What is the difference between a thought and a physical sensation? And then really fine-tuning those components. That is really the entry to what we call, quote unquote, awareness. And unless you're trained on those key components, we can't pick up any exercise that's holistic or that's super, it's meant to do that mind-body connection thing that we talk about, because it won't make sense. Well, at least for me. And the people that I've helped were in the same boat, very smart, successful people. They were so busy, and we were so busy focusing on our careers and our family and our doing the thing that we weren't taught to be, quote unquote, mindful or aware of our body and what sensation. And it almost seemed pointless, or I was like, it seemed like, what do you mean? And then unfortunately, that's where we get all the data we need to diffuse the panics and anxiety. It's in there. Not the only place, but that's the hardest place to access when you don't have the tools.
And really, I mean, it's so much like fibro, where your body is sort of doing something without you.
Yeah.
Right. Like I didn't consciously choose this.
Yes.
When
Oh
you
my
have
God.
a flare or whatever. Right. And I think I probably have a lot of the same kind of clients that you do, my private clients, really, really smart people, but you can't think your way out of what your body is doing without you thinking. That's part of the whole problem.
It's true. I mean, you can tell me about your fibro folks. I just gave them a name, fibro folks. The ones who are listening who have fibromyalgia, you could tell me about this, but I have people, I currently have a doctor. He's a DO actually. And he said, I just was never taught this. I have so much anatomy and physiology training. I have so much clinical experience. And somehow these pieces were never strung together for me this way. And he has performance anxiety. And he was like, I can't be a doctor with performance. I have too much to do. Another one of my clients was I have a lot of managers or people seeking management positions. And so the way they end up realizing these are such a pain in their behind is because they'll try to go for a promotion and they're like afraid to take on that promotion additional stress because they think, okay, I won't know how my panics are going to behave. So very intelligent, successful people, driven people, except then there's this whole thing called a panic attack that gets in the way.
Very much the same, right? And I imagine that the stress and anxiety, right, like go together, just like fibro and stress. And so thinking about, if I go into this, if I get this promotion, if I have added responsibility, like there will be more stress. And then we're stressing about there being stress. Right. It's just like this never ending pile it on, worse and worse. Yeah. And at some point you have to figure out a way to deal with it, whether that's fibro or anxiety, panic attacks. Just at some point, if you want your life back, you're going to have to figure out how to address it. Fortunately, there's people like you who have done some research and have some answers. So I think this would be a great time to transition into some of that more practical stuff. So somebody out there listening who's like, yep, that's me. I got it.
Yep.
What's next?
Well, what I want to do is kind of talk about a thing most people with anxiety and panic attacks will seek out first. It's silly, but I did this. If you're like me, you probably did a quick YouTube or Google search for like breathing exercises that help my anxiety, right? And so this was one of the first things I wanted to address because what I found was I tried some and it made my anxiety worse. And so then I was like, well, what's to that? Because every, person says, take a minute and breathe. In fact, my Apple Watch tries to remind me to breathe. So what's to this? And so instead of just teaching you a breathing exercise, I would rather teach you criteria for picking one that's right specifically for anxiety, because they're not all made the same. And that's the thing I didn't know. And so the way a breathing exercise works, or breathing in general, but the premise behind a breathing exercise is that you're intentionally taking in some kind of air, like you're deciding it. We're not just breathing with autonomic, functions. And you are allowing for proper amount of gas exchange at your lungs. So for those who are listening and may not know this, is what happens at the lungs, the primary molecules that exchange are oxygen goes in and CO2 comes out. And if we don't give enough time for that exchange to happen properly in the lungs during a breathing exercise, then your blood pH doesn't shift properly. There are these enzymes called carbonic anhydrases that modulate the pH in your blood. And if the pH isn't adjusted properly during that gas exchange with those enzymes, then what happens is it becomes favorable for your body to keep those anxiety molecules happening. So unless we have the right gas exchange or the right breathing exercise, we can't essentially adjust our blood pH, so we chill. That's the real gist of it.
I love all that science.
Yeah, I was like, we just need with a breathing exercise, we're intentionally creating an atmosphere in our body, an environment in our body to favor chill molecules, or the real way is to exclude non-chill molecules, anxiety molecules, right? So what we're trying to do is just get everyone shunted over to a state physiologically with breathing to where you're basically more in what we call homeostasis, where the home base is not anxious. And so the key to picking up a breathing exercise is that first and foremost, it has to allow time for that exchange to happen properly. The other thing that it has to do is that it has to capitalize on the psychology of the breathing, which I didn't know. But if you think about this, if you go up on a hike, and probably if you're having fibro, you may not be doing those activities anymore, but you could imagine anything where you accomplish something, or you see it in a movie where someone gets to the top of a hike, they're at this beautiful vista and they're seeing everything, and they will do something like this and exhale, right? That audible exhale actually triggers your muscles to relax, right? So you'll see this a lot in yoga when they say exhale loud. It's more like a reflex. It's a muscle reflex, and it causes the muscle to relax. So if you're stretching and you exhale audibly, your brain is triggered and says, hey, this is a good thing. Chill out, and your muscles will physically loosen, and you could get a deeper stretch that way. So when you're doing a breathing exercise, you want to make sure that that part is included. So I always say this: if you're anxious and all else fails, focus on the exhale, because then you'll trick your mind, but you're going to prompt your mind to say things are okay audibly. So now you've not only engaged oxygenation, but you've also engaged your hearing, because it's hearing the relaxation, right? And then you, of course, having a very physical experience. And then the other thing is, when you pick a breathing exercise, this is super important. It has to be short enough, easy enough to remember, so you could do it anywhere. because what I was finding was my Google and YouTube searches said, breathe in for 8, out for 4, hold for 10, jump on one foot. Like I didn't know what combination of anything to do.
Well, and when you're in the middle of an attack, like your brain can't think, right? Like that's part of the problem.
That was my thing. I was like, well, the reason it doesn't work also is because I can't remember it. So I came up with this 3-3-3 breathing technique. I almost feel like I didn't come up with it, but I've described it as such, where you inhale through your nose for 3 counts, hold for 3 counts with your belly distended, and then exhale audibly for 3 counts. And then you repeat that 3 times. So if you're in the middle of an anxiety or panic attack, you could just remember, he said something like 3-3-3, and that's it. So all you have to do is do everything 3 times. The reason I did that is because if you're at an office, you could do this right at your desk. If you're, driving and you feel the anxiety come on, you could pull over the side of the road and do this. You could be at a cocktail party or a mixer or happy hour trying to score points with the CEO, and you could go to the bathroom and do this. So it was something, that last point, that it was easy to remember and easy to do anywhere, was very important for anxiety relief, because bringing anxiety baselines down requires a constant monitoring and adjustment. And the beauty about this 3-3-3 is you can sense when you've taken enough air, but it's not too long where you hyperventilate and get dizzy.
Right.
Yeah, because I don't know if you're listening, if you've done that, you're probably chuckling, because I have hyperventilated.
Done that.
Yeah, me too. I have hyperventilated during a breathing exercise. So 3 in, hold 3, out 3, repeat 3 times is the formula. And it checks all those boxes, as it allows for gas exchange. It allows for the real physiological thing to happen that needs to happen. 2, it capitalizes on the psychology of it. And 3, it's just easy to remember and to do. And, instead of me teaching you all the things that I got into, that was my job. As a professional, I've done the go through all of them. That is the thing I would like you to know, is if you're picking one and you're trying it out, does it check those boxes? Because that's going to really affect on how effective a breathing exercise could be for your anxiety.
That's awesome. And that is so simple, so easy to do. Yeah. Yeah. Now, with some of these tricks and tips, like this breathing exercise, I understand the wanting to bring your baseline down, right? Like if your anxiety is up here, we need to calm it down. So I would imagine that there's some of this that you want to be doing every day, right? Like I don't just want to be breathing when I'm in the middle of a panic attack.
Yes. So it's very true. Part of the reason why I'm just going to take breathing exercises as an example, because we just talked about it, is part of the reason they're not effective is because you can't do them once and have them solve the issue. In fact, breathing affects one of the 3 major components of anxiety, not all 3. So the 3 major contributors or factors that cause anxiety, one has to do with the mental, one has to do with the physiological, and the third has to do with environmental. The breathing only addresses the physiological, the body part. And so, as you can imagine, 1, it doesn't solve all 3 components of it. And 2, you would need to practice it in order for it to be effective when you needed it. And also for it to be effective to, as soon as you have that awareness of when anxiety is climbing, you could use it to stop it in its tracks. And so there's 2 reasons why just hearing me explain this on this podcast won't be effective. It would have to be done practice essentially when you're not anxious. You have to practice it regularly. That's one of the things I actually have to teach them, is how to schedule out practice time in a way that still works with their life, because they're busy. They have kids, they have jobs, they have responsibilities, they're managing people, all the things. How do you make practice of your actual healing from your anxiety practical and functional within your day? Because we can't all be renunciates. And that's a term that's used to describe people in spiritual practices who dedicate their life to it, that remove themselves from society. They're called renunciates, but we're not like that. We can't dedicate our entire life to our breathing technique because we actually have other things to do. We have things to do.
Right.
Right. So how do we not become renunciates, but still practically get the solution and get that? And that just requires some scheduling. And one of my clients texted me. She said, I love that you put me on the schedule and you reminded me because I have issues with accountability. Like she actually said that to me. I was like, oh, of course, this is why we're here together.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I am so that person. I learned a long time ago, if there was anything that was important to me that I really wanted to accomplish, I had to hire a coach, right? So like writing my book, building my business, even working on my health, because I need that external accountability, right? Just doing it for me isn't quite enough.
I know, right? It's crazy how that happens.
It feels like it should be, but it's like,
Yeah.
I'm just not wired that way.
Same. In fact, the whole application of this from person to person, the tools I learned to do that with were when I worked with a coach, because I worked with a business coach, and those tools really translated to managing, hey, our life and our actual healing structure and our healing modality and our healing strategy. And same, I needed a coach to do all the things. And I'll tell you, she got me there. My coach really worked for that. So for me, it's true too. Accountability, structure, a plan that actually gets me the goal that I'm looking for really actually takes the anxiety away, to be honest, because I don't have to recreate it. Someone has already done it for me.
Right, right. Yeah, because that's a huge piece too, right? Like coming up with all of the things, from scratch versus asking somebody who has this whole arsenal. I would imagine that managing anxiety, like managing fibromyalgia, is unique to the person, that there are some things that work for one person and don't work for somebody else. So there's a little bit of trial and error and figuring out your own magic formula.
Absolutely. Well, we can take two things, time and physical body. I know they're unrelated, but I'll explain. So time, let's just say one client has just way less time. They're a vice president or a manager. They might have less time. So things like the actual plan and strategy has to be tailored to that schedule versus another client. When it comes to body, like the breathing exercise I just explained, sometimes 3-3-3, or the way your physical body has breath capacity, you could hyperventilate in 3 versus 2, and so adjusting even a breathing technique to your body because of your own physical breath capacity would actually have to be adjusted per person. And that was the other part about my self-Googling strategy that was inefficient is because I was a larger person. So I know you can't see me, but I'm 6 foot tall and I was a baritone saxophonist. Like I have a huge breath capacity, and breathing short breaths were really rapid for me. They actually increased my heart rate, and I either hyperventilated or it caused me stress. It activated me. It was because of the way they were describing it, became something more like what we call the breath of fire, which is an energizing breath. So unless I tailored it to my body, I didn't get the same relief. So yeah, those are two examples of how any little thing in managing anxiety really is tailored to the person. So there's the plan and a system that gets you there, and then the micro adjustments that have to be made are really what make or break that shift in the anxiety coming down in a more what I'm going to call permanent level. But really it's an emotion, so there's nothing permanent about it, but bringing that baseline in a measurable sense down to where it's not triggering panics.
Right. Oh my goodness. There's so many more things we could talk about, but we are kind of getting at our time.
Yeah, that was great.
So why don't you share a little bit about the book that's over your shoulder there?
Yes. Yes.
And I know that you have a place where people can go grab a copy for free. So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yes. All the things that I've been talking about, like the subject and topics, I do refer into my book called Stop Pressing Your Own Panic Button. And I want to give it to everyone who's listening for free, just as a gift. And Hopefully it is a resource for you. To get that copy, just go to panicfreedombook.com and you'll get a download straight there and you could review everything at your leisure. And, I won't burden you with a lot of different ways to contact me. Once you get that book, it'll also give you additional information on how to follow me and all the fun little things.
Absolutely. And we'll have those in today's show notes too. So if you're listening in your podcast app, just go to the little show notes link and we'll have that there for you. And you can go grab a copy of Stop Pressing Your Own Panic Button. I love it. So as we wrap up, I would love to just give you the chance to speak to the person listening who is struggling with anxiety, struggling with panic attacks, has fibromyalgia as well. So again, capacity diminished. What would you say to them and just speak to them from your heart?
From my heart to you, what I want to say is don't give up. I know it's so cheesy, but with the amount of physical things happening, coming at you, it's so scary, it's taxing, it's energy draining. I know there's fibro fog from hearing your podcast, and I know there's anxiety fog from the kind of work that I do, and it could be super overwhelming to start. And what I say is, at the very least, keep listening and don't give up. Allow yourself to ask the question, is there more, and what does that look like for me? Is there a solution, and what does that look like for me? Because it was really allowing that space to see other solutions in my brain that was the first and key step for me finding out what a panic freedom life would look like. And I encourage you to do that too.
That's awesome. I remember having that moment with my fibromyalgia, actually, like when our doctors are, giving us all that they know what to do, and it's not enough. And I remember having that moment thinking, okay, what if there is something else out there? How would I find it? Who could help me with that? Where would I find it? So thank you so much, Ramses, for being here, for talking with me about your area of expertise.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been such a blast and an honor, really.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And that wraps up my interview with Ramses. I think you can tell why I invited him to share his expertise. He's got such a great blend of all that super smart, sciencey stuff with the down-to-earth and practicalness of somebody who has lived through this. I find that his approach is very similar to my own in that same way. So if you like my stuff, you'll like his stuff. Make sure you go grab a free copy of his book. Go to panicfreedombook.com. And as always, we will have links in today's show notes, along with these other couple of episodes I'm going to list out for you. So today's show notes are at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/84, or you can just look in your podcast app, wherever you're listening, there should be a link to the show notes. Now, 2 more episodes I wanted to mention to you. When Ramses and I were talking about capacity and how the baseline for somebody with anxiety is higher and perhaps closer to that panic threshold, and someone with fibromyalgia is also kind of stuck in fight or flight, so our capacity is also diminished. That baseline is higher and again, closer to the panic threshold. There is an episode where I talk about this question of capacity and how so many things can either add to or diminish our capacity for dealing with things. And so often you'll find yourself sort of pushed over the edge by something super small, but it's because there was all these other things leading up to that. So if you want to kind of explore that idea more, I would recommend listening to episode 49, where I talk about what I call the bucket theory. And there's things that go into your bucket, and if you have too many of them, your bucket overflows, and that's where you have a fibro flare or perhaps an anxiety attack. Another episode you may want to check out is a more recent one. This is episode 81 with Sarah Kleiner as we talk about befriending your nervous system. You'll notice that in this episode, Ramses talks about certain breathing exercises working better than others. Sarah actually talked about that as well. So if you want to explore more about your nervous system and why certain things might be working for you and why some things that work for everybody else don't, then go check out episode 81. You can look that up in your podcast app or just go to today's show notes, fibromyalgiapodcast.com/84, and we will have a link to both episode 49 and episode 81. Now, I want to give this week's listener shout out. This comes from Amal. And she said that I could share her name. In fact, she also said that her name means hope in Arabic, which I love. If you listen to this podcast, hopefully you know by now, hope is my word. Anytime somebody tells me that they have hope again, I feel like I've done my job. That's my measuring stick. So here is what Amal had to say. She says, Tami, thank you so much for your podcast. It brought me to tears in a good way. I just discovered it today, and I cannot wait to finish binging. I feel every word that you say. I have for years, but I never heard it out of the mouth of somebody else. Thank you so much. I really cannot thank you enough. And thank you so much, Amal. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Like I said, it's why I'm here, is to help you guys find ways to feel better. And so if this podcast is doing that, then I am doing my job. And that makes me happy. So thank you so much for that. I just want to remind all of you, I love sharing these listener shout outs on the podcast. I think it's helpful for you to hear from other real people. We have thousands of people all over the world in hundreds of countries listening to this podcast. But sometimes when I'm sitting here in my office recording it, I feel like I'm the only person in the world. So it really helps me out to get feedback from you about what you're liking about the podcast or even the things that you might want to hear on the podcast. So thanks again, and we'll be back here next time. And that wraps up another episode of the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stacklehouse. For daily doses of hope, inspiration, and practical advice, come hang out with me on Facebook. Visit facebook.com/fibrocoach to find my personal coaching page and connect with me directly. To find the show notes, additional resources, or to schedule a consultation with me or one of my coaches, visit fibromyalgiapodcast.com.